Greetings, everyone. I am here today with my friend, Dr. Samuel Noble, who is joining us all the way from Belgium to talk about the peculiar history and character of the Orthodox Church of Antioch, something that is curiously relatively unknown to Orthodox Christians in the English-speaking world and elsewhere. So, Sam, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Sam is an Orthodox Christian, and he's a historian specializing in the history of Christianity in the Middle East. And from what I can tell, he can read or speak pretty much every form of Arabic, both modern and historical, as well as multiple other ancient and modern languages. He's also the co-editor of the Orthodox Church in the Arab World, 700 to 1700, an Anthology of Sources, which was published by Northern Illinois University Press, as well as the editor and or translator of other related works. And Sam is soon going to be teaching a live class online via the Orthodox Studies Institute covering Antiochian history, including Antiochian saints and other key figures, the church's response to Islam, the role of the Arabic language, how it related to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and just how it has survived for roughly 1,300 years under Muslim rule. And the course begins May 8th, and it runs for 4 weeks total. So, Sam, to start us off, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you, I mean, I'm sure people could tell from your name, you're not I don't know, a native son of Antioch, so to speak. So how did you find your way into the Orthodox Church, and what interested you in the Antiochian tradition in particular?
Well, so I guess best way to talk is sort of to give an academic biography rather than maybe a spiritual biography. But I'm from Georgia in the U.S. originally. I studied linguistics at the University of Georgia and did Arabic as a kind of concentration in that.
Okay.
And then after I finished my undergrad, I moved to Lebanon to study at the American University of Beirut, primarily Arabic literature, a bit of history. And during that time there, for various personal reasons, I converted to Orthodoxy in the parish of in Mazra, Beirut, with Father Bullis Wahby. And so after that, I went on to graduate studies at Yale, where I was studying at the same time, although he was a number of years ahead of me, with Alexander Traeger, who's now a professor and priest in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
And he kind of brought up to me that, there's all these texts, and they're really interesting, both from a sort of philological academic point of view, as well as a spiritual point of view in Arabic, and that nobody's, or not many people, let's say there were people working on it, but not a lot of people were doing work on it.
Hmm.
And well, why shouldn't we? And that led to us producing that anthology that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And that kind of led to sort of the focus of my career, as it turned out, or at least the focus of my academic work on Arabic-speaking Orthodox Christianity and other Christianity in the Middle East. I wound up finishing my PhD at the Catholic University of Leuven in the theology faculty, where I did my dissertation on the very, very important 11th century Antiochian Orthodox translator and philosopher Abdallah bin Fadl al-Balkhi. And yeah, so I've continued to work in that direction
Yeah.
in my academic life.
Yeah. And what a lot of people may not know is that you also have a blog called Notes on Arab Orthodoxy, which is pretty much all translations from Arabic of stuff that, into English, of stuff that English speakers may not otherwise have any access to, right?
Yeah, no, I don't work on it super lots anymore because I really don't have time with the family and
Sure.
work. But if you go to it, there's probably thousands of pages of material translated from different contemporary Antiochian Orthodox voices, where my goal at least was to sort of give sort of the perspective of Antioch. So I didn't edit it based on, well, I like this writer more than that writer, or something like that, but I tried to sort of convey contemporary Orthodox life in Antioch. So at least for sort of the early 2000s and the 20 teens, you can go there and see well, a lot of what people were saying in Syria and Lebanon
Yeah.
during that time.
I mean, I particularly have found it valuable. I mean, you and I have known each other for I was thinking about maybe 15 years or so now, if I recall
Yeah,
correctly.
that's about right. Yeah.
And and so I've been reading your blog all this time, and I found it very useful because probably like a lot of other American Orthodox Christians, I'm constantly seeing stuff about, Greek Orthodox elders and saints from the modern era, Russian Orthodox, I mean, and the list goes on. And yet there's this lacuna, this sort of gap. I mean, in the Antioch, at least in the US, the Antiochian church is one of the major jurisdictions, one of the major traditions present. And yet almost nothing is kind of coming down the pipeline that a lot of even members of the Antiochian Archdiocese in America would be aware of coming from the actual contemporary Antiochian tradition in the Middle East. And so I mean, why do you think that Antiochian history and tradition are so little known in the rest of the Orthodox Church,
Well,
including
I
people
mean,
who
if
are
you
Antiochians, but outside of the Middle East, you know?
well, I mean, if you think about sort of the history of the Antiochian Archdiocese, these are people who had to spend their time focusing on assimilating to American culture, assimilating to American life, making a stable life in North America. And before the internet, before modern communications, it was very hard to keep in touch with that. Um, so I think that, yeah, in the 20th century, for a long time, there wasn't close communication. There were not many ways of disseminating or ways of accessing what's going on in the Middle East. And then, for a bit, it's a bit hidden behind the Arabic language, and so you have to both have the Arabic language and the leisure time to work on translating it and
Yeah,
conveying it. And that didn't really exist. I think that's changing quite a lot now.
yeah,
I think Metropolitan Saba is making quite some effort to change that. And things are going in a very different direction, both because the Archdiocese has matured and doesn't have those same concerns and also because now the recent immigrants from Syria and Lebanon are more able to bring with them what's been going on spiritually in Antioch,
yeah,
and that's really the other big difference. So
yeah,
I think that will change quite a lot
yeah.
now,
My
but
own
for a long time it was hard.
I was gonna say my own impression of I mean, I think the English speaking world has been more interested in, I mean, I'm using these as just counterexamples, but more interested in the Greek language and culture, and more interested in the Russian language and culture, for example, for a long time. It's just kind of within our cultural mix, I think. And I think it's maybe because it's European. Um, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think Russian culture is a lot more similar to American culture than
Mm,
Arabic culture is, and there's always Western Russophiles who've learned Russian and found orthodoxy through contact with Russian culture. Maybe it happens, but there's not been sort of the core of intellectuals like there has with the Russian Orthodox Church. And the uh, in the Greek case, I mean, there's a lot more written material, and there's a lot more going back and forth in the 20th century.
yeah,
But again, I think the current situation is that Arab Americans are becoming more like Greek Americans with a much more recent diaspora, who are still more connected to their homeland. I mean, the people who moved at the end of the 19th century just took a boat and never heard from their families again, basically.
yeah.
It was a
Just
very different time.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Okay, well, part of what I'd like in this interview is for people to walk away with a kind of quick and dirty outline of the history of the Antiochian Church. I know, very easy. 2,000 years of history should be no problem in just one interview. But so, why don't you give us a sense? Probably most people's thoughts about the Antiochian Church in the Middle East is they think, well, that's the place where Muslims are, and so they live under Muslim rule. But for the first many centuries of church life, that wasn't the case, right? I mean, Islam shows up only several hundred years into the history of Christianity. So why don't you give us a kind of an outline, a sense of what Antiochian history was like up to that point where Islam moves into the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, well, so first six or so centuries of Antiochian history would sort of take its own
Yeah, I
course,
know.
or it's
I
quite a big
know.
guidebook. So I mean, there's a lot there to say. Okay, from the apostles to Saint Ignatius and Saint John Chrysostom, et cetera, and the councils and all that would take a long time. What I might be useful to talk about or just highlight very briefly is sort of two factors in Antioch that became important for the rest of its life after Islam. And one is the fact that Antioch never really, it was never monolingual or monocultural. Sort of the
Hmm.
Syrian space and the space that even in the early centuries, Antioch sort of opened up to and was in close contact with in the Caucasus and further east, was always multilingual. And even in the core areas, there was always sort of two faces for Antioch. That there was the Greek-speaking Antioch and Syriac-speaking, or Aramaic-speaking and Syriac writing Antioch, and so you have always um, a kind of complicated mix of cultures. I don't think there's been any period in the history of the Patriarchate of Antioch where they used less than two, and usually it's been three, four, five languages
Wow.
of theological life.
So in those
Uh,
early centuries, then, I mean, what cultures and languages are we talking about that were part of the Antiochian Patriarchate?
in the core areas, in you know what's now Syria, Lebanon, southern Turkey, it was Syriac and Greek, and
Okay.
both of those were literary languages where people might have spoken something quite well, somewhat different. Um, and that, but then also Antioch always had a very close relationship with the Church of Georgia.
Hmm.
There were always Armenian populations within the Patriarchate of Antioch. Even after the Council of Chalcedon, there were always Armenian speaking Chalcedonians. There are early on you have there still exists manuscripts of a Middle Persian Psalter that seems to have been done for Chalcedonian Orthodox
Oh,
purposes
wow.
within the Patriarchate of Antioch. So there's always been a lot of linguistic and cultural diversity, and always an openness to use different languages as needs be. Uh, the other big difference, or big distinctive, is that Antioch has always been uh, in Christian terms, multi-confessional, but also multi-religious, even
Hmm.
before Islam, or if go back to the Bible, Antioch is a city. There's discussion between Jews and early proselytes from paganism, but there's always been various random religions like Manichaeism or what have you, that people had to respond to interact with. And starting really in the fifth century, there were many forms of Christianity dissenting from the Council of Chalcedon
Hmm.
or earlier councils. And so the Patriarchate of Antioch has always had to exist alongside other Christian confessions and to engage with that on a great variety of different levels, whether polemic and apologetics or more cooperative forms of interaction.
So why do you think that is? Like, why is it that, I mean, the probably the stereotypical story that people have in their heads about, the early church dealing with heretical groups and so forth is that, once it's decided, then the emperor tells them to take a hike, all the heresy is sort of cleaned out or something like that. Why is it that it seems to be present and there's this proliferation of these dissenting groups
I
and so
mean,
forth?
there's the Syrian space is huge.
Hmm.
It's much bigger than if you compare it to Palestine, where the imperial church was able to keep a degree of uniformity, and the Palestinian monasteries are sort of compactly centered in South Palestine and able to also have a great deal of influence. Whereas before modern travel, Syria is quite big, and never really ends. I mean, or in terms of the patriarchate, in terms of where it ends to the east is never defined,
Yeah,
and
right.
goes,
Yeah,
sort of goes on into the steppe, really.
what exactly does
Um,
all the East mean in the
right, right, and so it's a big space, and again, it's not a uniformly Greek speaking space. Um, it's not so it doesn't have the geographical compactness, cultural uniformity, or the ability for the state to really define religion in the same
Yeah.
way that in other regions this was possible.
So how much of pre-Islam Syria, I mean,
Mm.
understanding that that doesn't equal the modern nation state of Syria, but sort of the Roman, whatever. But I mean, how much of the Antiochian Patriarchate is outside the Roman Empire?
Well, that's a really, really complicated question
Okay.
because so on the one hand, you always have interaction with Georgia, which is always an independent state with its own king, its own thing going on, with a
Yeah.
very not really defined relationship to Antioch. Antioch,
Mm.
they often take canonical decisions from Antioch, sometimes have people consecrated from Antioch, but not always. They're often doing their own thing, and Antioch has a sort of strong influence on Georgia, but not control over Georgia. So, I mean,
Interesting.
the idea of being able to draw out the patriarchates like nation states doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And also in the Persian Empire, um, there was always a more or less functioning independent church that they accepted the Council of Nicaea only in 410. And this was under the advice and instruction from a bishop from within the Roman Empire, within the Patriarchate of Antioch, named Marutha, who issued his own canons and, well, helped in organizing the church in the Persian Empire on a diocesan Roman style structure with acceptance of, starting with Nicaea, those churches, but that, or those councils. But that church always had a life on its own and went on in its own, after the controversy over Nestorianism, went on its own theological direction, which was very separate, right, and became its own separate confession. And then after that, there started to be, starting with prisoners of war and possibly native communities, it's unclear, um, Chalcedonian Orthodox communities in the Persian Empire and then the former Persian Empire. So it's always, I mean, everything basically to the east of the Euphrates is a very fuzzy territory in a way, and where Antioch is the church is the church that people interact with from the Orthodox tradition. But it's impossible to really map out exactly, this territory is this or that.
Yeah, there's a sort of flexibility in more ways than one. I mean, cultural flexibility, linguistic flexibility, geographic flexibility, canonical flexibility, it seems like. Um, yeah, that's fascinating to me. So, okay, so as we know, Muhammad does his thing. Islam becomes a major, not just religious force, but I mean, it's a political force and moves into the Middle East. And people can look up if they want to read all that history, they can certainly look all that stuff. But how does life change for the Antiochian Patriarchate with the rise of Islam? What
Well,
does that
I
do?
mean, so I mean, well, to not get too detailed, there's kind of two big changes that are really important. The first is the loss of a consciousness as being an official religion. Now, this is a bit complicated because, well, Roman emperors were not always Orthodox by any
Right.
means, and
Right.
especially immediately before the Muslim conquest, emperors, especially Heraclius, were very not Orthodox. And so there has already been a kind of writing off of the idea of a state church in the 7th century, especially in the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, under the influence of Saint Sophronius, who was a companion of Maximus Confessor, who had an entire sort of ideology of replacing the Roman emperor as the guarantor of the unity of the church. And this spread to Antioch, I think, from Jerusalem, even starting before Islam, the idea that the emperor cannot maintain church unity. And church unity is to be found in orthodoxy of faith and correct practice
Hmm.
rather than in unity with the emperor. So that's a 7th century change right on sort of the eve of Islam. But it continues, I mean, it becomes more accentuated, obviously, under Islam, where the church is no longer even has a notional idea of, well, we could regain support from the state.
Yeah.
Uh, so you have that, and you have that Christian or Orthodox Christians were put on the same sort of secondary subject level as all other non-Muslims, as Jews, uh, and as the other Christian communities, and that required obviously a great deal of adjustment psychologically and reinforced tendencies that had already been happening. Um, and so right from the start of the arrival of Islam, uh, the church had to start finding new ways to uh, define itself relative to other communities, both in terms of competition and in terms of being able to, articulate Christianity in an Islamic environment. The other major change which happened with Islam is the adoption of Arabic.
Hmm.
And what's really interesting with that is that the Orthodox, as Chalcedonian Orthodox, adopted Arabic way faster than any other community and much more thoroughly.
Oh, interesting.
So by the beginning of the ninth century, Orthodox or Arabic is the main language of Orthodox church life, probably for everything except for the liturgy. The liturgy remains even in Antioch, mostly in Syriac. Very hard to find evidence for use
And
of
and
Greek.
I think I've read that the liturgy at that point was not Chrysostom's liturgy.
Well,
Is that right?
right, yes. There was an earlier liturgy. They used the anaphora of St. James, but the details of the other parts of that liturgy and what it entailed hasn't really been worked on pretty very well yet.
Hmm.
There's a Ukrainian Catholic scholar named Daniel Galadze who's done a great book on how this change happened in Jerusalem. But it's much harder with Antioch because the manuscripts don't really survive, and so you can get bits and pieces from later manuscripts of earlier things, but you don't get a good picture of really what's going on.
Yeah.
Uh, but in any event, the change to Arabic as the main language of theology, as the main language of the biblical readings in the liturgy, and some parts of the liturgy, and of church administration really comes uh, starting from the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 and was quite solidified already by 800. And this, I mean, really continues today, that there's a specific Arabic Orthodox Christian discourse that's now over 1,000 years old that came about quite quickly after Islam.
Why do you think it is that the Chalcedonian Orthodox adopted Arabic much more quickly and thoroughly than the other Christian groups in the area?
Well, one, the most likely explanation is that Greek had outside of the city of Antioch itself always been sort of like English now today is in Europe.
Hmm.
Like if I go to Brussels and encounter someone who speaks French, or if I don't know if someone is a French or Dutch speaker, I'll speak to them in English. If I'm writing an academic paper, I'll write in English. If you know, a lot of government things or EU level things come down in English. So it's the language that every educated person has to know. It's sort of the language of intercultural communication and of high culture um, for lots of people who never speak English at home. And that seems to have been the case both in Syria and Palestine, is that there were very few people speaking Greek to their mom. That Greek was something you were enculturated into, that you learned to be part of the wider world's discourse. And if you were speaking only to your home community, you might use Syriac, you might use in Palestine Christian, Palestinian Aramaic. But Greek is sort of just the natural way to do written culture,
Yeah.
including the uh, and so it was very easy to make. Well, no, it was very easy. It took enormous effort by many anonymous translators, but it was a sort of a natural thing to switch from one imperial lingua franca to another.
Gotcha.
So, so the role that Greek had after so early on, uh, Muslim rulers during the Umayyad Caliphate had used Greek as the language of their bureaucracy for tax registers and things like that, and this gave a lot of opportunities and influence for Orthodox Christian bureaucrats under the Umayyads, like the family of St. John Chrysostom. But after the bureaucracy was changed
Do you
over
mean
to,
Saint John of
oh,
Damascus?
no, Lord, St. John of Damascus, yes,
Yeah, yeah.
sorry.
I mean, he's a big. I'm sure you'll mention him, but he's a
Yeah, no,
big
St.
figure in
John
all
of
of this.
Damascus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry about that. Um, And so, but when the bureaucracy was changed and the way to make a living for an educated person for a person changed, then it became natural just to use Arabic as your language of high culture, of things like doing theology, of things like doing church administration.
Okay.
So that so Arabic basically took over the role that Greek had had.
Hmm. Gotcha. Gotcha. So, okay. So, I mean, with the rise of Islam, essentially, this kind of brings us into the medieval period of the Middle East. So, I mean, for me, this is mostly kind of a blank. Who are the big figures in that period? I mean, what is it if someone, I mean, many Orthodox Christians would know about various medieval figures from other traditions. Who are the ones that you should really know?
Well, yeah, setting aside St. John of Damascus, who everybody's familiar with,
Yeah, yeah.
another figure that people, or who is at least accessible for people to become familiar with, is Theodore Abukura,
Okay.
who was into the 8th, early ninth century. Well, he started out as the Bishop of Haran, but had to leave his see for one reason or another. And he became kind of an itinerant, uh, Orthodox Christian apologist. Uh, in Arabic, or he says himself, he wrote several treatises in Syriac that don't survive, and there are a lot of Greek writings attributed to him that seem to have been translations from Arabic or Syriac. Um, and his corpus of texts has mostly been translated. There's a good volume. I don't think it's in print, but you can find it it was translated by John Lamoureux. So he's somewhat accessible that people can get to know.
And as I
Uh,
recall, you've got maybe some things in the anthology that you helped to
Yeah,
edit
no,
that are from
the
him.
anthology has something from him that Lamoureux translated for us. Um, there's also I'll talk about in my class the life of Saint Timothy of Kakoshta, who was an ascetic saint in northern Syria in probably the ninth century. That we have two quite long and detailed lives of that exist in Arabic that
Hmm.
have been edited in Arabic and translated. And there, if you go out and look for it, was an academic publication, but you can find them. Um, there's also another figure I'll talk about quite a lot is the Patriarch Christopher, who was the Patriarch of Antioch from 960 to 967, who had been a layman and a secretary in the service of the Hamdamid Emirate in Syria that sort of gets pulled into Antioch as patriarch. It's very common in the medieval and medieval period for laymen to become patriarchs and
Yeah.
bishops. That generally, if you're an unmarried, educated man, they were at least as often as monks chosen for bishops. And
Oh,
this is a bit of an
interesting.
Antiochian uh, unique characteristic, at least in the medieval period. But what's interesting is that his life was written under Byzantine rule after the Byzantines retook Antioch in 969. Um, but the author, who we've now has now been identified as a bureaucrat in the Byzantine civil service, or writes his uh, life with a lot of sympathy for the Hamdanids, who are the Byzantines' great enemy in Syria, and talks up the Hamdanids' good treatment of Christians and their treatment of Christopher. And so, even though he was a figure that was closely associated with the Hamdanid Emirate, as soon as the Byzantine and he was martyred by Muslim enemies of the Hamdanids who had come in from Central Asia during the sort of chaos of the Byzantine reconquest. But immediately after the Byzantines come in and establish control over the city, his relics are found and moved to the treasury of the Patriarchate of Antioch, where the lance that stabbed Christ, various things associated with Saint Ignatius, and uh, Saint John Chrysostom and Saint Peter were kept. That his
Hmm.
relics were kept there. So it's an interesting indication of the ambiguity about Byzantine and non-Byzantine rule, uh, even after the Byzantines came back in. And I guess I'd sort of be remiss if I didn't mention one more figure from the period of Byzantine rule, who most of my academic work is focused on, who is Abdallah ibn al-Fadl al-Antaki, who was a translator of biblical, well, a translator of patristic text, and he edited earlier patristic translations to be in a high literary register of Arabic.
Hmm.
And he also wrote a great deal of theological, philosophical works where he combines patristic, uh, the patristic tradition with Greco-Arabic philosophical texts that were produced in Baghdad a little bit before his lifetime. And so he shows a great deal of interest on the part of the Arabic speaking Christians of Patriarchate of Antioch under Byzantine rule for the Arabic philosophical tradition
Interesting.
and engagement with Baghdad. A friend of mine, who's now a professor at Yale, Joe Glenius, he wrote his dissertation, which should be a book in the next year, called Baghdad on the Orontes, talking about
Ah,
Antioch under Byzantine rule being a great center of uh, Arabic culture. Uh, so that even when they were under Christian rule, when they were in a state where your opportunities to advance yourself came from knowledge of Greek, that Arabic high culture was highly cultivated in Antioch during this period, and sort of was the high point um, in the pre-modern period of the Patriarchate of Antioch.
wow. I mean, it's just so, I know it's so provocative, I want to ask a bunch of questions about that, but I want to kind of continue our outline.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, okay, I'll just say like, I mean, so my comment is that in many ways, I think that even what you've just said up till now kind of explodes a lot of our stereotypes about the Orthodox past, which I think that we tend to be so used to the idea of maybe of nation states that we project that backwards.
Yeah, definitely.
And like almost everything you've said completely violates that stereotype, with regards to Antioch. And I'm sure that's in many ways is probably true of a lot of the other traditions as well. Although Antioch is our focus. I mean, it's interesting to me that there wasn't just simply this, like you're talking about this, Baghdad on the Orontes. Of course, for those who may not know, Antioch is the city that's on the Orontes. It's the great city on the Orontes. So this idea that even when, as you said, Greek is the language of culture and government and so forth during this period in the 10th century, that nonetheless there is this flourishing of what has been there, and there wasn't just a sense of, okay, well, we're Greek again now, so let's get back to being Greek, because of course everybody knows that that's what Orthodoxy is.
No,
Um,
and there's a lot of complaints about Greeks from this period. So, like the life of Timothy of Kakushta begins like at the very beginning, saying, "Well, why are we going into such detail to write a long life of this saint?" Well, in Constantinople, the Greeks, okay, and this is quite important, given some current conversations, that in pre-modern Antiochian texts, they never use the term "room" to define themselves. Room is the Byzantines. That's not us. And
mm,
here it says that the Room don't care about Syrian saints. They especially don't care about Syrian saints who lived under Islam. So we're going to go forward and write this text of this life of this important saint so that he's not forgotten with this cultural change in Antioch or the political change in Antioch.
yeah, so there's this desire to kind of preserve identity and even influence it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. Okay, so all right, eventually, as we know, as is very famously known amongst Orthodox Christians, Constantinople falls to the Turks. But so does the whole Middle East. If it, at some point, the Ottomans rule over the Middle East up until, basically World War One, right? So what does Antioch look like during the period of Ottoman rule?
Well, it was in some ways a big improvement for Antioch because
Ah,
after the Crusades, the Mamluks, which was an Egyptian, well, a dynasty based in Egypt, ruled, and that was really quite a dark age for Middle Eastern Christianity.
hmm.
The Mamluks were both really not good at ruling and were unusually cruel Christians.
And isn't that the period during which I think Saint Jacob of Hamatura wasn't he martyred
Yeah,
during their rule?
he was under the Mamluks, yes.
Yeah.
Um, and that it was by the Mamluks that the city of Antioch was more or less completely destroyed. The monasteries around it were destroyed. Things that had survived the Crusaders had were gone, erased, and so we don't know a lot about what the medieval tradition of Antioch, except for the manuscripts that made their way to Sinai. And so over half of what we use to sort of reconstruct Antioch's history comes from manuscripts that, well, basically refugees or monks trying to get away from the Mamluks to Syria or to Sinai brought with them to Sinai and copied
Hmm.
there. So the monastery of Sinai's library, which is now for the Arabic part, is not only digitized but is available online freely, is really a game changer. But for what happens with the Ottomans, on the one hand, you have a real sort of regrowth of Christianity in Syria. That demographically,
Huh.
the Christian population expands relatively to the Muslim population for reasons that haven't entirely been explained. There's also a big movement of Christians from the Kalamun Mountains surrounding Yabrud, this area, where Syriac had been maintained up until that period, into the big cities. So Aleppo becomes a huge center of Orthodox Christianity. By the 17th, end of 17th century, it's about half the population of the Patriarchate of Antioch
Oh
is
wow.
concentrated in Aleppo,
Wow.
with a relatively upwardly mobile merchant class. Now, on the other hand, for the institution of the Patriarchate of Antioch, things aren't great. The Ottomans are very aggressive, not only about forcing the jizya tax, the poll tax that non-Muslims have to pay, onto the local population or the Syrian population, but the system of bribery that's involved in recognizing the patriarch himself upon the election of a patriarch is disastrous.
Mm.
The patriarchate is always teetering around bankruptcy because on the one hand they're trying to pay the jizya for poor Christians so they don't convert to Islam. On the other hand, they're having to bribe Ottoman officials pretty much constantly to be recognized and to be able to do their function.
Mm.
So things are quite complicated. The other thing that goes on in the Ottoman period is the world kind of opens up to Syria. That the Mamluks have been quite closed off from the non-Islamic world. I mean, I suppose a historian would nitpick here, but compared to anything before them or after them, they were quite closed off. And so you get Western merchants, you get a lot of Roman Catholic enormous number of Roman Catholic missionaries, but you also get an opening of the Patriarchate of Antioch towards the rest of the Orthodox world. So
Hmm.
contact with Russia begins, contact with, well, the Patriarchate of Constantinople renews, and things with Georgia become much more, well, consistent. And even when the Ottomans take the city of Akhokitse in uh, southwestern Georgia, so Georgia was under Persian control or sort of Persian suzerainty, but the Akhokitse became under Ottoman control. The Georgian church gives Akhokitse to Antioch to be able to pastorally serve because they can't go across the border with the
Interesting.
Ottomans. And so, and there's actually throughout the Ottoman period, this wasn't just symbolic. They're sending bishops, they're sending people to southwestern Georgia to do a pastoral function, which is quite remarkable. But, so you get things during this period. In terms of the liturgy, there's kind of a second Byzantinization that the Bishop of Aleppo and then briefly Patriarch Meletius Karma uh, translates as many liturgical texts as he can get into Arabic on the basis of printed Venetian editions. The Patriarch Macarius, who I'll have to talk about a lot because he's sort of the biggest figure in Antioch in the Ottoman period, uh, does everything he can to uh, translate and propagate new liturgical texts along Constantinopolitan lines. And this resembles, I mean, it was not controversial. I can't find any evidence it was controversial, but it's very similar to what happened in Russia under the Niconian reforms. That you
Hmm.
get printed Greek liturgical texts become the standard. And Macarius even himself translated a couple texts relate that were popular also in Russia in the Niconian reforms. There's a um, liturgical commentary that I've been working on by a figure from the Ecumenical Patriarchate named Ioannis Nathanael that was used as the standard interpretation of the liturgy in Russia. And Macarius translates it or adapts somewhat, but translates it into Arabic to sort of mainstream kind of set the 17th century norms for Orthodox liturgy into Antioch,
Interesting.
where before things had been quite chaotic, uh, also because people had lost their Syriac.
Hmm.
So Macarius talks about Syriac being their normal language of worship, and he wants to keep either Syriac or Greek for the Eucharist or for the priest's parts of the Eucharistic liturgy, but otherwise they're translating everything else into Arabic,
Oh, interesting.
or often retranslating, really.
So if you were in the altar, you would have heard Syriac or Greek, but what you're hearing sung in the nave would have been in Arabic. Is that right? Roughly true, maybe.
Probably. It's hard to reconstruct. There's a couple manuscripts in Balamand where they have all the instructions and the for what the priest should be doing and lots of parts of the liturgy in Arabic. But everything that the priest or deacon says, they have in parallel columns in Greek or Syriac, take your pick.
Interesting.
Uh, and this I mean, we don't have a lot of manuscripts,
Yeah.
but this seems to be the norm. We actually have a ton of Syriac liturgical manuscripts from the Ottoman period that have never really been looked at. There's a whole big
Wow.
collection at Oxford that's not even cataloged.
So, I mean,
But I can't find.
I was gonna say, would it be correct to say then, I mean, since you mentioned that, that um, maybe some of the ignorance of Antiochian history and tradition is simply because a lot of the work to just do critical editions and translations and stuff of what does exist in manuscript, a lot of this work just hasn't been done.
Yeah, of course. And that's,
Wow.
because it used to be you had to travel to the Middle East. You
Yeah.
had, or find something in a Western library. The British Library is quite good. They have books copied or in Antioch in the 11th century. That the British Library is great because they don't really police it. You can just go in and they'll give a card to anyone and say, "I want this manuscript from 11th century Antioch," and then you're touching it. It's wonderful.
Wow.
But
That's crazy.
with the digitization done by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which is a part of a Benedictine university in Minnesota, that they've done, and the digitization of Sinai manuscripts, it's kind of made it accessible to anybody. So I can work on these things, on my sofa. And
Wow.
this is something that 15 years ago was still hard, that you either had to ask for microfilms of things or you had to travel somewhere and hope a bishop or a librarian or someone would give you permission. But now it's quite accessible for most uh, collections. Almost all Orthodox collections are in the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library's digital archive, um, and a lot of the Catholic collections.
Amazing. Amazing. So I know one of the big events that, I mean, I don't know, maybe the biggest event that looms large within the Ottoman period is the 18th century Melkite schism. So I know a lot of people who study Orthodox history know something about it, but maybe people who are listening to this conversation between you and me don't know what the Melkite schism is. So tell us about that.
Okay, well, that would take
I
a
know,
lot to.
again,
Yeah,
my
so
my
so so
my
it.
my dad always joked that when he was in the Navy, that to the guys who were new to, he worked on nuclear reactors in the Navy, and he said that one of the quizzes they would give to brand new nuclear engineers, it said, uh, define the universe, give three examples. So I know that this is that kind of that kind of question, you know.
Yeah. So, I mean, talking about the major sort of trends in the Ottoman period, we have the opening up to the rest of the world, including to Western Europe, through the presence of merchants. We have the very strong institutional weakness on the part of the Patriarchate of Antioch. And we have an upwardly mobile laity uh, who have, and oftentimes have commercial connections to the Greek world or to the West.
Yeah.
And another factor, a big trend, is that during the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church realized that they were going to lose much of Europe. And to balance that out, they became much more active with Christians of the Middle East
Mm,
in different ways. But they started out, the missionaries were trying to make sure that Middle Eastern Christians were not sympathetic to Calvinism. This became even more acute with the story of the patriarch Cyril Lucaris in Constantinople, who was sympathetic to Calvinism.
yeah.
But they started with that, but then they started to try to convert locals to Roman Catholicism. And they did it in a very strategic way. So, because they had vastly more financial resources and vastly more education than the locals, they were often just accepted. Oh, great, you're a Christian from the West. We'll let you preach. Sometimes we'll let you take confession. We'll have good relations with them. And as it became clear that they were very financially powerful, different factions in within the Patriarchate of Antioch would try to get their support for patriarchal elections and things like this,
Mm,
because that could tip the scales and get them enough money to
wow.
bribe the right Ottoman officials and things like this.
Wow.
Um, and their policy for from the 16th century till the end of the 18th century, or to the end of the 17th century, was to try to elicit written confessions of faith privately by individuals rather than to create a Catholic Church in the Middle East. Now,
Mm,
this is sort of a funny thing. We have some of them that have been published. They're not all published, and you can see that very often Antiochian bishops were playing along with the missionaries because they were a power base. I mean, with the Ottomans and also increasingly with the commercially successful Syrian bourgeoisie. And so, like with Macarius, for example, he's said to have signed a Catholic confession of faith. And he wrote very effusive letters to Louis XIV asking for aid.
huh.
Um, although his confession of faith has never been published, unlike some of the others. So there's this, I'm somewhat suspicious that he didn't give the right wording that they wanted. But even though he was always very um, well, outwardly supportive to the missionaries, if you read his son, the Paul of Aleppo's journal, that they can't stand them.
Mm,
They call the Jesuits always Yazidis, which was the Kurdish sect that was rumored to worship the devil. I mean, they can't stand them, but they can't get around them.
yeah.
And so they're sometimes useful in a political sense, and their religious influence has been quite strong. I mean, especially with the wealthy. Uh, and nobody knows how to solve this. So, uh, what happens at the end of the 18th century is that the Bishop of Sidon, whose name was Euthemius Saifi, and Sidon was functionally the port of Damascus. It was a major commercial center in this time.
Okay.
He is even more pro-Catholic than the missionaries. You know, he writes things talking about how Constantinople fell because they didn't support the Crusaders, how France has always been the greatest thing ever.
Wow.
And he takes a like hyper Western historical point of view, but he revises the liturgy entirely to fit Tridentine norms. So he removes the epiclesis, he removes the use of Xeon, he tries to super Catholicize everything, often against the advice of the missionaries who, one, they within Roman Catholic canon law at the time, and the canons of the Council of Florence, you can't really do this. There's an agreement that if Orthodox become Catholic, they get to keep all these things. But Saifi was against that.
Hmm.
And Saifi starts basically a church within a church. He founds a monastery near Sidon called the Monastery of the Savior, which is still an important Greek Catholic monastery, the center of the Salvatorian or Mahalisite order, which is still the most pro-Latin element of the Melkite Catholic Church. And he also got permission from Rome to be a super bishop for all Catholics in the Middle East.
Hmm.
So even though the two patriarchs who were contemporary with him, Macarius's grandson, Cyril V, and Athanasius III Dabas, who by the end of his career was extremely anti-Catholic, even though they were considered by some of the missionaries to be crypto-Catholics, Rome says, no, this guy is the bishop for Catholics in the Middle East. Now, he and Athanasius Dabas die around the same time. And what happens is that his nephew, Cyril Tanis, sort of took on his mantle. And he makes an agreement with the missionaries, or some of the missionaries in Damascus, some are really skeptical, that he'd be able to take over the patriarchate. And he has the financial backing of the French merchants to do this, so they're able to bribe off a lot of people. So what he did was they held an election. Uh, Now, this election was of there's 300 names of laity who voted for him, and some of the clergy, about maybe a couple dozen, or a dozen to a couple dozen clergy. I can't remember the numbers. And there's precedent in the Patriarchate of Antioch for the Patriarch of Antioch to be elected popularly.
Hmm.
In the medieval period, or prior to 969, this was standard, but it had never been done without the presence of a bishop, which goes against all kinds of canons, and it had never been done with the acceptance of the Senate. So they did this election. They had the support of the uh, Ottoman governor of Damascus to do it. He was given his fees, and he said he would support the Sultan to okay it. Uh, but that didn't work out. Uh, Around the same time, while Athanasius Dabas was dying, the Holy Synod was meeting there in Aleppo, his hometown, which often was the seat of the Patriarchate in practice from
Hmm.
Macarius's time, because it was the demographic and financial center. Now, Athanasius, before he died, uh, appointed his nephew, whose name was Sylvester, as the next patriarch. Sylvester had been the protosynglos of Antioch as a deacon during part of Athanasius's time, and the tradition of patriarchs appointing their successor, while again not canonical in any way,
No.
happened quite a lot,
Huh.
although always with the approval of the Holy Senate.
Yeah.
So Sylvester had been appointed uh, by Athanasius, and he was accepted by the Senate, who wrote to Constantinople, consecrate. Now, this is there was kind of a race because there's no standard for the Ottoman state to decide who would be legitimate patriarch. They don't care about Orthodox canon law. They don't care about anything else. It's whoever could convince the Ottoman authorities quicker gets to have the patriarch. So what
Wow.
happened was that they wrote to call Sylvester back from Mount Athos, where he apparently might have been studying icon painting. It's unclear exactly what he was doing there, but he was on Athos for a while, and they recall him. Um, and he's again elected by the Synod in Dimissa in Constantinople, which had both the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Jerusalem together on it. So they also give their election to him. What's fascinating is that this was not at all their plan. So, in a lot of popular accounts, both Catholic accounts and some Orthodox accounts, that Sylvester was this Greek who had been appointed by Constantinople against everybody's wishes in reaction to Antioch electing a Catholic patriarch. This is
Yeah.
not at all the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
The
that's the version of the story that I've always read.
Right. Well, that's super not what happened. We have, and it's been published since the beginning of the 20th century, the letter that Constantinople did want to impose somebody. They have a letter pointing the Patriarch of Antioch that they want, saying that they would receive the Barrett, which they hadn't yet. It seemed to have been written in anticipation of the Turks agreeing with it, for a Greek bishop from Anatolia to put him in. But they scrapped that when they found out what the Senate and the people of Aleppo, especially the merchant class in Aleppo, supported Sylvester, and so they scrapped that, and then instead they brought in Sylvester, who was from Cyprus, but he was an Arabic speaker. His brother, there's a great book on this that just came out at the end of last year, by a Romanian scholar, Mihai Țipău. Let me um, entitled Sylvester of Antioch, uh, the life and achievements of an 18th century Christian Orthodox patriarch. And he doesn't go into the canonical details of Canis's election, but he talks a lot, but he explains what happened with Sylvester. And Sylvester was an Arabic speaker. Mihai, who's a friend of mine, he found letters in Greek by Sylvester to the bishop of his hometown in Cyprus, talking about his brother, who he calls Suleiman in
Mm.
Arabic. I mean, he's from the. I mean, there's always people from Cyprus going to Syria, Syrians going to Cyprus. So he's from the um, Arabic speaking population of Cyprus. He was basically he was clubbable with the Greeks because he had very good Greek education, but he was an Arabic speaker who had lots of family connections in Antioch and was the nephew of the previous patriarch. So the Senate accepts him, and he comes in. What happened on the Greek Catholic side is quite hilarious. I'll have to go into it, I guess, more in the class. But they couldn't get a bishop to consecrate Seraphim Tanas, who was a priest. They got a single renegade bishop who recused himself from the meeting of the Holy Synod in Aleppo, to go to Damascus, along with a bishop that had been consecrated by an Armenian Catholic and a Maronite Catholic bishop, who was the special bishop of the monastery there inside, the Salvatorian monastery. And they, realizing this wouldn't look canonical at all, got themselves consecrated a third bishop to try to find three. Um, and immediately the missionaries quite freak out about this. And it's published in Mansi's collection, in the early 20th century, but a letter from I think it was a Carmelite, the head of the Carmelites in Damascus, writing to Rome saying, look, can y'all recognize this guy? He is clearly, and using the Roman Catholic terms that he used, illicit and invalid in his consecration. And Rome basically took 20 years to say, well, the movement that he started, we can't end. We're going to go with it. Ironically, Sylvester was supported entirely by the Franciscans and some of the other missionaries in Aleppo, because they hadn't quite realized how anti-Catholic he was. But so it's quite a wild story that I'll go into more. But it was the schism was not so much a split in the Patriarchate of Antioch, but the creation of a new Latin church that uses modified Byzantine rite in Syria
Huh.
that a lot of Orthodox wound up joining,
Wow.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely revises, like I've always heard it just called the Melkite schism, suggesting that there's a group of Antiochian bishops that go this way and a group that go this way. Um, but as you're saying, it's this creation of a new church that a number of Orthodox then kind of convert to.
Including bishops. So, I mean, if people, I don't know, some of your audience freaks out and says, "Oh, does this mean that the Melkite Catholic Church doesn't have valid holy orders or something like that?" No, they got bishops on later. They had Latin consecrations, things like that. So from an Orthodox canonical point of view, they're the same as the Latin Church,
Hmm.
um, which even their patriarch now says.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
That's an interesting development. But so okay, I know that the next period then um, that there's basically a series of Greek patriarchs, and from what I understand, that this period often referred to as the xenocracy, so ruled by foreigners, literally. Um, that a lot of Antiochian tradition and maybe Antiochian saints and so forth get kind of pushed off to the side, erased, forgotten. I don't know what are we looking at here. I mean, like you mentioned, Patriarch Saint Christopher from the medieval period, right? Like he's a big deal, a big deal in Antiochian tradition, and it seems like
right.
no one's heard of him now.
Well, I mean, some of that had already started with the translation into Arabic in the earlier Ottoman period of Greek liturgical texts.
Okay.
So someone like Macarius was promoting uh, this tradition and these saints, and even his circle copied one of the copies we have of the Life of Christopher. But this didn't make it into printing. This didn't make it into sort of the Synaxarion that was translated and sort of diffused. So the official liturgical text changed much earlier. What happened in this xenocracy? And it started in a much more complicated way than I think our accounts of it are. I mean, it would be impossible to say that Sylvester was a foreigner, uh, given his fact he was an Arabic speaker. He was closely attached to Antioch. Also, Constantinople, when Sylvester died, their first choice was not to impose Greek bishop. The
Hmm.
first person they wanted to be the Patriarch of Antioch was he had been one of Sylvester's deacons, and his name was Sophronius Al-Kilisli, who was from northern Syria, probably grew up speaking Arabic and Turkish. He was an Arabic speaker, and he, I think, because it was a very tough job, refused the job of Patriarch of Antioch. And but instead he became the Patriarch of Jerusalem for a while, and eventually Patriarch of Constantinople. So he's,
Hmm.
to my knowledge, the only Arab Patriarch of Constantinople. But
Interesting.
even in the mid 18th century, there wasn't these strong nationalist lines, even though Constantinople was now in a position where they could more or less dictate who would be patriarch. And they were in a position where they were incredibly um, skeptical of the Syrians as thinking they might be pro-Catholic.
Hmm.
And but after Sylvester's death, there was a situation where there's about 150 years of Greek patriarchs. It's not like the situation in Jerusalem where well, until recently all bishops were Greek. Um, Rather, there were a lot of local Syrian bishops, and there had always been Greeks as bishops, mostly Cypriots, as bishops in Syria. There had even in the earlier Ottoman period been two bishops or patriarchs from Chios, and this wasn't a source of ethnic conflict or a source of uh, any kind of cultural imposition, really. But in the second half of the 18th century, partially, I guess, because of sort of the general degeneration of Orthodox life under the Ottomans, where bishops really saw their sees as a source of income or a source of advancement, Antioch got lousy patriarchs.
Hmm.
And because Antioch was far too poor for a bishop to, well, gain personally from it at all.
Hmm.
And so it was often seen as a stepping stone to becoming Patriarch of Jerusalem, where you get pilgrimage money, or to something else in the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And these bishops never learned Arabic. They never really tried with their flock to do any kind of pastoral work
Hmm.
in much of a meaningful way. Now, sometimes the laity of Damascus could force them to take action in a positive way, but they were generally pastorally inert and not at all culturally connected with the patriarchate. And so you have either local bishops or priests who have to do the job of um, serving the pastoral needs of their laity, of pushing back against Protestant and Catholic proselytism, things like this. And so there's activity still in Antioch at that time, but it's really hampered by the office of patriarch being, well, not a positive factor.
Yeah.
And then in the second half of or starting in the middle 19th century, you start having the Russian mission, where the Russians are able to establish, well, they established tons of schools in Palestine because the Russians are very focused on Palestine, very focused on, their pilgrimages there and the even presence of Russian clergy there. But they also start establishing churches in, rather, establishing schools in Syria. They're entirely in Arabic. And this was a very self-conscious thing on the Russians' part because the British Protestant missionaries and American Protestant missionaries used English. The French Protestant mission or the French Catholic missionaries used French, and were really trying to Anglo-Saxonize or Francify their proselytes,
Hmm.
which was quite successful among Lebanese Catholics. You still meet them today. They're very Francophile,
Yeah, sure.
and they still educate their kids in French. But for the Orthodox, the Russians realized that there was basically no social advantage to someone in Syria speaking Russian. We have documentation from their internal conversations where they say, well, look, if we raise up a Russian speaking elite in Syria, what they're going to do is come to St. Petersburg and look for a bureaucratic job. We don't have bureaucratic jobs for them. We don't want them here. So we have to educate an Arabic speaking Christian elite in Syria. And this is what they managed to do.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, which also led to a greater conscious. Once you have a local lay elite who are educated, they say, well, why don't we have the patriarchate back?
Yeah.
And so in 1899, and I'll go in, I guess, in the class more about the details of this, finally the patriarchate was restored to a native Syrian. And again, I think it's better to talk about it as native, even though by the end of the 19th century, they were talking in nationalist terms in Arab versus Greek, that it's really, it's a return to the pattern of native control. Uh,
Yeah.
and there, even after that, there were individual Greek bishops in the Patriarchate of Antioch. You know, actually, yeah, the last one was the Bishop of Baghdad, died maybe 10, 15 years ago. So there's always been contact with the Greek world. There's always been Greek clergy in Syria, but in 1899 they were able to restore local control, both of the choice of the patriarch and getting a local as patriarch.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, well, that brings us into the 20th century then. And I mean, already now we're getting figures that are at least like late 19th century, St. Raphael of Brooklyn, who does play a role, from what I understand, to some extent in the church in the Middle East. And of course, another very famous figure from that period, St. Joseph of Damascus, who's martyred there in Damascus in 1860, as I
Six,
recall. Um, but one of the big things that I remember that I learned about, that was again this sort of big gap in 20th century Antiochian history, is the rise of the youth movement in the middle of the 20th century, which my understanding, that event really kind of determines the course of the patriarchate up until the present day.
yeah.
So maybe give us a framework in which that occurs, and some sense of this. I know they often use the French initials for it, MJO, but the Orthodox Youth Movement. So tell us about that, and tell us how it really affects the church.
Well, if you go a little bit, I guess, earlier in the 20th century, I mean, getting local control by no means was a panacea,
Yeah.
and by no means made things great in the Patriarchate. There, I mean, among the early 20th century patriarchs of Antioch, the one should mention Gregory Haddad, who was patriarch during World War I and the enforced Ottoman famine in Mount Lebanon, that probably will eventually be glorified as a saint. But often the patriarchs weren't great. The uh, um, and a lot of church life had declined or had not improved, um, starting from earlier.
Hmm.
So men's monasticism in the early 20th century basically didn't exist.
Yeah.
There were really no functioning men's monasteries. The level of education, because especially after the Russian Revolution, there was no chance for an Orthodox education. If you wanted to be educated in Lebanon or Syria, you had to go to the Protestant or Catholic schools.
Yeah.
And this was a real problem. The French mandate, which began at the end of World War One, was very, very pro-Catholic in what became Lebanon, much to the detriment of the Orthodox. And they even attempted to create a schism in the Orthodox Church to separate the Syrian and Lebanese parts.
Oh, wow.
Uh, and so, where the youth movement got its beginnings was among Orthodox, I think mostly law students, so I don't think they were all law students, in Catholic universities in Lebanon who wanted to push back against Catholic proselytism, um, but by by recovering their own tradition and by learning what it meant to be Orthodox. And because they'd studied in the Catholic schools, they knew French. And so they were also able to sort of ride the wave of Orthodox revival coming from the Russian diaspora in Paris. So they were able to read sort of the Paris school people,
Oh, interesting.
and the people from Saint Serge and the first generation of sort of Orthodox leaders from that period often studied at Saint Serge. And so they basically, if you read the writings from this period, some of which I've assigned as readings from the course, they are trying to recover their tradition. They're looking out to the rest of the Orthodox world about how to do that, and creating a lot of connections, especially with Western European Francophone Orthodoxy. Um, and they slowly also um, start saying, well, we need monasticism if we're going to have Orthodox practice of it. And so one of the early members of the MGO, Father Elias Morcos, founded the monastery at Deir el-Harf, which was sort of the refounding of Orthodox men's monasticism.
Hmm.
Now contemporary monasticism in the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch has come on later to be much more connected to Greece and monastic currents in Greece. But at the beginning, it was a kind of these guys were trying to use any resource at hand to recover things on their own. And another factor of the Orthodox youth movement was extremely anti-political. So the Orthodox in Lebanon has this sectarian political system where
Yeah.
political offices are divvied out by sect,
Right.
the seats in parliament are assigned by sect, etc.
Yeah.
And all the other communities have their own political party. Now, there were a lot of Orthodox who joined Maronite parties. There were a lot of Orthodox who joined the Syrian National Socialist Party. There were who joined the Communist Party. But the MGO basically wanted to keep the church separate from politics. And this is part of really its lasting legacy, um, was that they prevented an association or prevented any political current getting the stamp of church approval,
Hmm.
uh, that for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and this still sort of ripples through Orthodox politics in Lebanon to this day.
Yeah.
Um, but it also meant that the church was able to stay together during the Lebanese Civil War and not endorse any faction, even though there was a great deal of sympathy for the Palestinians on a human
Yeah.
level.
I remember
Um,
I remember reading at one point, it really struck me that it gave a kind of window into what church life was like before the rise of the MJO, which was that one of the requirements for membership in the movement was that you had to go to liturgy 3 Sundays in a row. Which
yeah,
when I heard that, I thought, so that's considered unusual. That was like a
yeah.
significant commitment, you know?
But I mean, even like say confession was. more or less not practiced in the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah,
Um, and things like this. So no, there was a revival of sacramental life. There was a revival of sort of all aspects of life in the mid 20th century. Um, Now, I think there were great difficulties in institutionalizing that type of revival, and being able to carry on that type of enthusiasm, that type of rediscovery had its own problems.
sure.
But that first generation, people like Metropolitan George Cutter and like Father Elias Moros, really, well, I mean, they brought the Orthodox back to orthodoxy, which was one of their slogans.
Hmm. Yeah. And it's my understanding that most of the metropolitans on the synod now are products of the youth movement. Is that correct?
A lot are. I don't know if it's a majority currently.
Yeah.
It has at times been a majority, and certainly uh, Patriarch Ignatius Hazim was very much youth movement oriented.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah,
I don't know if this is like a legend now, but I heard a story about Metropolitan George Kludder when he was sort of, um, he was trying to encourage regular communion because like most of the Orthodox world, I think maybe all of it, I don't know, had gotten out of the habit of regular communion. It would be once or maybe a few times a year or something like that. And that, at least the story as I was told it, is that at one point he stood up in front of the Holy Synod and simply said, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Uh, and that this was kind of this electrifying moment in terms of encouraging people to commune again on a regular basis, to prepare properly, of course, for communion, but that the Eucharist was a normal part of church life.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
and that was a well, it was a sea change in practice in
Mm.
Middle
Mm.
Eastern Orthodoxy to have regular communion.
Yeah. So okay, so here we are now. It's 2025, and you know, uh, gobs of stuff is digitally available online, just waiting for people to learn the languages and do the work and so forth. What kinds of efforts are there to recover some of this marginalized heritage? I've heard, for instance, that Elder Tuma Batar had took a whole bunch of saints' lives that were otherwise relatively unknown and put them into a single volume. Like what tell us about that, for instance.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I mean, that's a great volume, and I've spoken with Metropolitan Sab about or he's brought up with me even the need to translate it. So uh, someone will probably translate it soon. Um, but yeah, Father Tuma, well, at the time when you could only you had to order microfilms, but there was an expedition to Sinai in the 1950s done by the Library of Congress that microfilmed most of it. He was able, just on the basis of microfilms, to put together a list of saints, or not just list, but also often their lives and some hymnography associated with these saints that had, well, not made the transition to a Greek style synaxarium. And yeah, that volume exists in Arabic and hopefully at some point in English. So yeah, he did work on that. There's a lot of work in Western universities now on all aspects of Middle Eastern Christianity. That 20 years ago in the English speaking world, it was almost only Father Sidney Griffith at the Catholic University of America, but now there's a lot of people working on it. At St. Joseph's University, the Jesuit University in Beirut, they're constantly preparing editions in Arabic of these texts and publishing them, although sometimes they're hard to get. So there's a lot of people working on this now. There's a lot of work being done. And I at least hold out some hope that some of this work will come to be done. And actually, there is stuff being done about Balaamand, but I'll say that I hope that there's more work being done for the Orthodox to take ownership of this heritage themselves.
Yeah.
And it's never really sort of been easier to do this, and it's never been more accessible than it is today.
Do you think, I mean, neither you nor I are a bishop. We don't make decisions like this, but just asking your opinion, do you think that, we'll see some of these forgotten saints brought back and their feasts celebrated again, and people get to know them
So
again?
Christopher is in one of the Antiochian Orthodox service books. In the back is an optional thing. I don't remember which book it is, but I've seen him there. And I don't
Okay.
know who decided to put him in there. I think that this would be a very good task to do.
Hmm.
I have been told by people in Lebanon that there is interest among bishops in doing it. Um, I do, well, there's a lot of other extremely pressing concerns,
Yeah, of course.
to say the least.
Yeah.
However, the recent glorification of early 20th century martyrs that took place, the Holy Synod did, which is I mean, so in the modern Patriarchate of Antioch, I recall, the only glorifications have been Joseph of Damascus, which took place in the 1990s, and this new one. And so this shows further interest of this on the part of the Holy Senate. And so I can at least be hopeful that yeah, at least some of the older saints of Antioch's tradition will make it back onto the calendar.
Yeah. And you mean Saints Nicholas and Habib Chasha,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually been privileged to work a little bit on the editing of the English service
Oh, great,
text for them.
great,
So I know some of what's coming down the pike because of some of the stuff they do
wonderful.
kind of in the background. And also there's, the newly established Feast of All Saints of Antioch that God willing is going to be celebrated for the first time this year. So
Right, and that
uh,
allows a certain degree of flexibility and kind of well, you can tentatively start introducing these saints back into people's consciousness by having a feast like that.
yeah, may it be blessed. Well, Sam, it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much
Thanks.
for this conversation today. I know we just kind of barely scratched the surface, but thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
It's been
yeah,
fun.
absolutely. Okay, well, everybody, if you want to do a lot more than just scratch the surface, make sure you sign up for Sam's course, which you can do whether you're listening to this before the course starts, which is just a couple of days, or after it started. You can sign up and you can have access to recordings. You can go to orthodoxstudies.org/courses, and the live version of the course is going to run from May 8th and will go for 4 weeks. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. Bye.